Now that we've got our tags rendering correctly and we have the remove functionality implemented, let's work on getting the actual input field itself to work. To start, let's take a look at the template in the original tag input. So you can see here up at the top, we've got a few things defined on the input element. We've got a v-model binding, which binds the input to some local data here, and that keeps track of what the user's typing. We have a key down listener that listens for the backspace key to make sure that if the user presses backspace when the field is empty, well, it goes ahead and deletes the last tag. And we can check out the implementation of that here. So here's handle backspace. All it does is check if the new tag is empty, will emit an event with the last tag removed. Finally, we have another key down listener listening for the enter key and also preventing the default behavior that calls add tag. The way this works is it checks to see, well, if the tag is an empty string or if the tag is a duplicate, then don't add it. Otherwise, emit an update event where we pass back a list that contains all of the old tags plus the new tag, then clear out the input field so that the user can start typing a new tag. We also have this computed property up here, new tag, and all this is doing is taking whatever the user's typed in the input field and trimming any white space to make sure that they can't create tags that are just a bunch of spaces. So to get started thinking about how to implement this, let's just copy all of these bindings and paste them into the parent template so we can think about how we want this to actually work. So one thing that's worth noting is that it's not possible using this renderless UI component pattern to pass back a v-model binding like this directly. But if you remember, v-model is really just sort of like a macro for two other bindings. It's a value binding where you're binding the value of that element to match whatever your data source is, and an input event listener where whenever an input event is fired, we're updating the data source to match e.target.value, which is whatever the user typed. So with these two in place, we don't actually need v-model here. So let's take a look at what we would actually need to pass back from the child component to get this stuff working. So value mapping to input, well, that's just a regular data prop, right? Not really any different from tags. In fact, it's a little bit simpler because it's just a string, not an array. We have this input listener that invokes this function. So this kind of feels like an action prop, right? This is kind of like an action that we want to run whenever this event is fired. It's not too dissimilar to what we're doing with click up here. We also have a keydown.backspace event, which calls another function. So again, this sort of feels like an action prop as well. And then we have another listener listening to the enter key, and that calls add tag, which again, you could think of as an action prop. So one way to get this working would be to pass back 4 new properties through the slot scope. The input event listener, the backspace event listener, and the add tag action that we're calling when we press enter. It would look something like this. We'd probably have something like the input value, we'd have the on input listener, we'd have the handle backspace action, and we'd have the add tag action. And now down here, we could replace input here with input value. We could replace this event listener with on input, and the other two are actually already correct. So while this would totally work, I don't really love this solution. And the reason for that is that, in my opinion, this is pushing way too much responsibility to the consumer to know about when and why all of these different actions need to be invoked. Making the consumer concerned about the fact that we're listening specifically for an enter key event or a backspace key event, or that we have to break up this v-model stuff, really sucks in my opinion. These are sort of like implementation details, and I would much prefer if we could keep the responsibility of knowing which events we're listening to and what actions we're calling as a result of those events in the renderless tag input, so the consumer didn't have to know about that stuff. And it turns out Vue does give us a way to do that. So something that you might know is that this :value prop, this is really just short for v-bind value. So these two lines do the exact same thing. Now, something that you might not know is that there's also a third syntax for v-bind. We could write the same code as v-bind equals, and then pass through an object where we have a value key, mapping that to input value. So I think there's 2 things about this that are really interesting. The first thing is that using this syntax, we can actually bind multiple attributes at the same time. So I could also add other keys to this object, right? So we could bind foo to bar or baz to zap or whatever we want. The other interesting thing about this is that it moves the knowledge of which attributes we're binding to the right-hand side of the equals sign. There's no knowledge on the left about the fact that we're going to be binding the value attribute. All of that lives inside of this object, and we can pass this entire object from the child component up to the parent through the slot scope. And this brings us to the third category of slot props, which are binding props. Binding props are a way for the child component to say to the parent, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that you need to bind to a specific element. You don't need to know about what's inside of it, but please just bind it and then trust that everything is going to work. Let's take a look at how this would actually work. Let's head up here and clean up some of this stuff in the slot scope for a second. And let's just pass back one slot prop called input props, the props that the parent needs to bind to wherever it decided to put its input element. Now, if we head back to the renderless tag input, we can add another key to our slot scope here called input props, and this is just going to be an object where we bind that value attribute to this .input. Now back in app.view, instead of v-binding this object literal, we can just bind it to input props. And now we can delete this value binding and this vbind value binding. And now the parent is binding that value attribute without even having to know which attribute is being bound to which value. We can apply these same changes to our event listeners as well. So just like with vbind, in view @input is really just short for v on input. And this is really just short for v on equals, and then passing through an object where we have an input key mapping to on input. By using an object like this, we can collapse all three of our event listeners here into this single object. Let's go and set this up in the renderless component first and then clean up what we've done here. So I'm going to add another slot prop here called input events. And this is going to be an object containing all of the event listeners that the consumer needs to bind to their input element. So we have an input event listener, and this is going to receive an event and set this.input to equal e.target.value. And this is just part of that vmodel binding that we had to sort of decompose into its two parts. And next, we have these two key down listeners, right? So we can't actually use Vue's convenient modifier syntax when we're writing this stuff in a render function, but we can still accomplish the same thing by just adding a single key down listener that accepts an event and then does some work. So if we want to emulate this backspace key down listener, all we have to do is check if e.key triple equals backspace, well then we want to run this .handle backspace. Similarly, if the enter key is pressed, well then we want to run add tag. So we can do another conditional here. We can say if e.key triple equals enter, well then we want to prevent the default, right? And you can see that here with the prevent modifier. So we can do that by just calling e.prevent_default, and then we can call this .add tag. Now if we've done this correctly, we should be able to save this file, head back to app.view, destructure input events alongside input props, and then replace all of this event handler stuff with just a single v-on binding where we just pass through that input events object. Now, one final thing that we need to make sure we do is copy over the implementations of handle backspace and add tag, since we don't actually have those defined in the renderless tag input yet. So let's just go and grab those methods from tag input.view. So we're going to need add tag and handle backspace. Add tag calls clear input, so we're going to need that. And add tag and handle backspace also both depend on this computed property and this data attribute. So we're going to need to grab basically all of this stuff. Why don't we go ahead and just grab all of the methods all the way up to the data here and copy all of that stuff in, replacing what we have here since our implementation of remove tag is identical anyways. So now what we've done basically is copy over all of the contents of the script section of this original tag input, but none of the template stuff. We replaced the template stuff with just a render function. Let's head back to app.view, go and refresh the browser and see if things are actually working. So we can delete tags, that's cool. Can we add tags? Added tag, enter. Hey, it looks like we can. What if I hit backspace? Will it delete the last tag? Looks like it does. What if I try to add a duplicate awesome tag? Oh, it won't let me do that. So it looks like we've fully implemented all of the behavior that we had in the original component using a renderless component.